The architecture of the military-industrial complex, a century of profit and power. Welcome to How the World Works. Today we are undertaking a massive, comprehensive investigation into one of the most powerful, invisible, and complex structures on the planet, the military-industrial complex. We are going to trace the flow of trillions of taxpayer dollars, examine the titans of the defense industry, and uncover the systemic mechanisms that sustain permanent war. This is not just a story about weapons. It is a story about corporate profit, political lobbying, unaccountable bureaucracies, and the profound warnings of history that have been largely ignored. Let us dive in. Chapter 1. The Origins and Essential History. To truly comprehend the sheer scale and influence of the modern defense sector, we have to start by examining its roots in the mid-20th century. It is a surprising fact to many, but before the outbreak of the Second World War, the United States did not possess a permanent, standing armaments industry. The nation maintained a relatively modest peacetime military. The historical precedent was simple. The country would spin up industrial production only when conflicts arose, and it would rapidly dismantle those manufacturing pipelines once the peace treaties were signed. However, the unprecedented global scale of the Second World War fundamentally altered this dynamic. The total mobilization of the American economy created an intricate, deeply rooted network of government agencies, armed forces, and private manufacturing corporations. By the time the war concluded, this apparatus did not dismantle. Instead, it evolved. The first known use of the specific term to describe this phenomenon occurred in 1947. An economist named Winfield W. Riffler attributed the outcome of the war to the balance of aggregate economic potentials of the warring nations, which he termed military-industrial complexes. Over the following decade, sociologists began to notice the societal shifts caused by this new permanent war economy. In 1956, Wright Mills published a seminal book titled The Power Elite. He argued that American society had fractured, cleaving into a powerful elite of military and corporate chieftains set against a largely powerless mass society. This conceptual framework set the stage for one of the most famous and prophetic speeches in American political history. Less than a week before leaving office, on January 17, 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower delivered his farewell address to the nation. Eisenhower was not a pacifist outsider. He had served in both the First and Second World Wars, rising through the ranks to become the third five-star general in United States history. He was the Supreme Commander of NATO and the President of Columbia University. Through his decades of military and political experience, Eisenhower grew increasingly alarmed. He realized that corporate interests were beginning to monopolize national priorities. In his address, he warned that the conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry was entirely new in the American experience. He cautioned that the total influence of this complex, economic, political, and even spiritual, was being felt in every city, every state house, and every office of the federal government. While recognizing the absolute need for national defense, he famously warned the nation to guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. He foresaw that the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power existed and would persist long after his departure from the Oval Office. This warning serves as the foundational lens through which we must view the ensuing decades of military expansion. Chapter 2. The $2 trillion black hole. Following the end of the Cold War, the defense apparatus did not shrink. It continued to expand, creating an administrative behemoth that frequently defied standard accounting practices. To understand the scale of this bureaucratic obscurity, we must look to a profoundly overshadowed moment in modern history. The date was September 10, 2001. On this Monday morning, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld delivered a startling speech outlining a massive internal crisis at the Pentagon. Rumsfeld stood before his audience and described an adversary that posed a serious threat to the security of the United States. He said this adversary stifled free thought, crushed new ideas, and disrupted the defense of the nation. He was not speaking of a foreign dictator or a hostile nation-state. He was describing the Pentagon bureaucracy itself. He clarified that he did not mean the people in uniform, but the processes, the systems, and the uniformity of thought imposed upon them. During this address, Rumsfeld made a shocking admission. He stated that, according to some estimates, the Department of Defense could not track $2.3 trillion. Let that number sink in. $2.3 trillion. To put this astronomical figure into perspective, at that time, $2.3 trillion exceeded the net value of the entire plant and equipment of all United States manufacturing industries combined. Rumsfeld explained that the financial systems within the Pentagon were decades old. Information could not be shared from floor to floor within the building because it was stored on dozens of technological systems that were fundamentally inaccessible or incompatible. In the corporate world, an accounting failure of this magnitude would immediately suggest monumental incompetence or deliberate falsification. But within the permanent war economy, monetary efficiency often takes a back seat to the maximization of power. Such staggering financial discrepancies were frequently brushed off by Pentagon managers as mere budget dust. Because the very next morning brought the tragic events of September 11th, this astonishing revelation regarding the missing $2.3 trillion vanished from the public consciousness. However, the systemic accounting failures never disappeared. Decades after Congress required all federal departments to pass an independent audit, the Pentagon remains the only federal agency entirely unable to do so. In later years, the Commission on Wartime Contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan concluded that between $31 and $60 billion had been lost to fraud and waste. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction reported that the Pentagon could not account for $45 billion in funding for reconstruction projects. An audit conducted by Ernst & Young for the Defense Logistics Agency found that it could not properly account for some $800 million in construction projects. Despite consuming more than half of the discretionary budget and controlling over 70% of the entire federal government's assets, the Defense Department remains a financial black hole. Chapter 3. The Architects of Modern Warfare. The events of September 11, 2001, catalyzed a massive expansion of the military-industrial complex, guided by figures who deeply understood the intersection of private enterprise and public war funds. Within this era, the roles of figures like Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld became instrumental in reshaping modern warfare into a highly privatized endeavor. Before assuming the vice presidency, Dick Cheney served as the chief executive officer of Halliburton, a massive Houston-based oil services and construction conglomerate from 1995 to 2000. In the immediate run-up to the Iraq War, Halliburton and its subsidiary, Kellogg Brown & Root, received special, unprecedented access to the war effort. In March of 2003, the company was awarded a $7 billion contract to put out oil fires, operate Iraq's oil fields, and distribute petroleum products. Crucially, this was a no-bid contract, meaning only Halliburton was permitted to bid for the work. This brazen lack of competition alarmed career civil servants. Enter Bunnatyne Greenhouse. She was the highest-ranking civilian at the United States Army Corps of Engineers and a veteran with 20 years of contracting experience. Greenhouse continually raised alarms about this arrangement. She explicitly noted that Halliburton had been unlawfully receiving special treatment for work not only in Iraq, but also in Kuwait and the Balkans. She asked hard questions about why billions of dollars of government business were being thrown to one company while others were shut out. Greenhouse further claimed that Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's office took direct control of every aspect of Halliburton's massive Iraqi oil infrastructure contract, bypassing standard procurement regulations. For her strict adherence to procurement requirements and her fearless whistleblowing, Greenhouse was severely punished by the administration. On October 6, 2004, she was summoned by a major general and handed a demotion to a GS-15 level, which was equivalent to going from a senior vice president to middle management. Simultaneously, the public justifications for the war were heavily sanitized. While Rumsfeld aggressively denied that the invasion of Iraq had anything to do with oil, calling the assertion utter nonsense, President George W. Bush later acknowledged that protecting energy resources from extremists was indeed a core strategic priority. This era demonstrated a brazen revolving door, where the architects of war policy had direct recent ties to the very corporations profiting billions from the conflict. They were looting the Treasury in broad daylight, while Pentagon auditors' reports on massive overbilling languished in bureaucratic netherworlds. For instance, a damning investigation by the Defense Contract Audit Agency nailed Halliburton for over $108 million in overcharges on just a single task order. Yet the Pentagon's civilian leadership mothballed this explosive report for more than 5 months, denying Congress a peek at the findings until well after the elections and budget requests had safely transpired. Chapter 4. Shadow Transfers. As the wars in the Middle East stretched on for over a decade, the true nature of these conflicts became increasingly apparent to those analyzing the data. The military-industrial complex was no longer just about defeating an adversary, it had become a highly efficient mechanism for wealth transfer. This reality was thrust into the global spotlight by Julian Assange and the transparency organization WikiLeaks. Starting in 2010, WikiLeaks began publishing a massive trove of classified documents provided by United States Army intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning. There were no fewer than 250,000 diplomatic cables from U.S. embassies around the world, alongside military logs from the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. These leaks exposed severe misconduct, including footage of airstrikes resulting in civilian casualties, friendly fire incidents, and the horrifying revelation that defense contractors were hiring child prostitutes. But beyond the visceral horrors of war, Assange articulated a profound economic theory regarding the fundamental purpose of these prolonged conflicts. In a widely circulated 2011 analysis, Assange claimed that the goal of the Afghan war was never to build a stable democracy or to achieve a traditional military victory. Instead, he argued that the objective was to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the tax bases of the United States and Europe, funneling it directly back into the hands of a transnational security elite. According to this framework, the objective of the military-industrial complex is an endless war, not a successful war. Think about the mechanics of this. A successful war ends, troops come home, and the funding ceases. An endless war, however, guarantees a perpetual pipeline of taxpayer funds into the coffers of private defense contractors and international elites. The physical location of the war matters less than the financial mechanism it enables. For exposing this system and releasing classified national defense information, Assange became the target of severe legal and political retribution. He spent years claiming political asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Eventually, his asylum was revoked, and British police forcibly removed him from the embassy. After a lengthy legal battle over extradition to the United States, Assange ultimately pleaded guilty in a 2024 deal to conspiracy to obtain and disclose classified information. Regardless of one's opinion on Assange, the revelations brought forward by WikiLeaks provided undeniable documentation that the war economy was operating exactly as Eisenhower had feared, acting as a massive shadow transfer of public wealth into private hands. Chapter 5. Unchecked Power. By the 2010s and early 2020s, the normalization of endless war budgets cultivated an environment ripe for profound systemic corruption within the military ranks itself. The oversight mechanisms meant to protect public funds proved entirely inadequate against the sheer volume of capital flowing through the defense sector. No incident illustrates the moral disaster of this unchecked power better than the Fat Leonard scandal, widely considered the most encompassing corruption scandal in modern military history. After the Cold War, the Navy closed its Subic Bay base in the Philippines, which opened up ship husbanding work to private contractors. Husbanding involves caring for everything a large warship and thousands of sailors might need when pulling into port, including food, supplies, fuel, and security. For over 25 years, Leonard Glenn Francis, a massive 6'3" defense contractor known as Fat Leonard, operated a company named Glenn Defense Marine Asia, providing these services to the United States Navy in the Pacific. Rather than competing fairly, Francis compromised the highest levels of the Navy's 7th Fleet. From the 1990s through his arrest in 2013, he bribed scores of Navy officers, including admirals. The bribes were lavish: millions of dollars in cash, expensive vacations, Dom Perignon champagne, and the services of prostitutes. In return for these illicit gifts, Navy leadership handed over highly classified docking schedules and deliberately steered aircraft carriers and support ships into ports entirely controlled by Francis. Once the ships were trapped in his ports, Francis routinely submitted fake invoices, overcharging the military for everything from fuel to sewage removal. He pleaded guilty to pocketing at least $35 million in fraudulent billings. What is most alarming about the Fat Leonard scandal is not just the financial fraud, but the systemic cultural rot it revealed. Hundreds of officers knew exactly what they were doing was wrong, yet the corruption became an accepted part of the organizational culture. This environment of unchecked power is not limited to the Navy. Between 2017 and 2024, the Department of Defense reported $11 billion in confirmed fraud. Major government contractors paid hundreds of millions of dollars to resolve allegations of double billing on weapons maintenance, providing false cost pricing data, and overcharging for spare parts. Yet, a look at the False Claims Act data reveals a disturbing trend. In 2024, the government recovered 18 times more money in healthcare fraud cases than it did in defense fraud cases, despite spending massive amounts in both sectors. This discrepancy suggests that a vast amount of defense fraud remains undetected and uninvestigated due to the immense scale and complexity of military contracting. Chapter 6. The Global Landscape. Transitioning from the localized corruption and endless wars of the past 2 decades, it is vital to analyze the current macroeconomic reality of the global military landscape. The years 2024 and 2025 witnessed a staggering escalation in defense spending worldwide, driven by rising interstate tensions, internal conflicts, and renewed great power competition. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, world military expenditure reached an unprecedented $2.718 trillion in 2024. This figure represents a 9.4% increase in real terms from the previous year, marking the steepest year-on-year rise since at least the end of the Cold War. The global landscape is increasingly dominated by a few massive spenders, meaning that while tensions exist everywhere, the steep increase is driven by a relatively small number of countries. The United States and China together accounted for almost half of all world military expenditure. The United States spent nearly $1 trillion, specifically $997 billion. China followed as the second largest spender at an estimated $314 billion, investing heavily in the modernization of its military, cyber warfare capabilities, and nuclear arsenal. The ripple effects of recent conflicts have triggered massive armament programs globally. Russia's military expenditure soared to an estimated $149 billion, which is a 38% increase from 2023 and double its spending levels from 2015. Ukraine, heavily reliant on its own spending as well as foreign aid, dedicated an astonishing 34% of its gross domestic product to defense, reaching $64.7 billion. Meanwhile, European nations drastically increased their budgets, with total spending in Europe rising by 17% to $693 billion. North Atlantic Treaty Organization members accounted for a staggering 55% of global spending, equivalent to $1.5 trillion. In Asia, Japan's military spending rose by 21%, its largest annual increase since 1952. In the Middle East, Saudi Arabia surged to become the 7th largest spender worldwide. This global build-up means defense spending has increased every single year for a full decade, surging by 37% between 2015 and 2024. The transition from the war on terror to a focus on advanced near-peer adversaries has guaranteed that the massive financial pipelines established over the last half-century will aggressively expand into the future. Chapter 7. The Titans of Defense. With $2.7 trillion flowing through the global military ecosystem, the obvious question arises: who exactly is receiving these funds? The answer lies in a highly consolidated sector of massive corporate entities, often referred to as the prime contractors. Over the last several decades, the defense industry has consolidated from dozens of competitive firms down to just 5 major titans. This consolidation severely restricts competition and grants these surviving companies unparalleled leverage over government spending. Between the years 2020 and 2024, private firms received $2.4 trillion in contracts from the Pentagon. This accounts for approximately 54% of the entire department's discretionary spending over that period. Out of this massive sum, an astonishing $771 billion went to just 5 companies: Lockheed Martin, RTX, formerly known as Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman. To illustrate the disparity in national priorities, consider this. The United States government invested more than twice as much money in these 5 weapons manufacturers than it did in its entire diplomacy, development, and humanitarian aid budgets combined, which totaled just $356 billion. Lockheed Martin stands as the undisputed giant of the sector, reporting roughly $71 billion in sales in 2024. Astonishingly, federal government contracts accounted for about 71% of their total net sales. They are deeply embedded in advanced military capabilities, from fighter aircraft and missiles to cybersecurity and space exploration. RTX follows closely, generating over $40 billion in defense revenue by providing critical missile defense innovations like the Patriot missile system and hypersonic weapons development. Northrop Grumman pulls in over $35 billion, leading the charge in nuclear modernization and stealth bombers like the B-21 Raider. General Dynamics secures over $33 billion, heavily dominating the naval shipbuilding market, delivering Virginia-class submarines to the Navy. Finally, Boeing rounds out the top 5, pulling in over $32 billion through programs like the F-15EX fighter jet and advanced satellite systems. These titans operate less as standard free market competitors and more as highly integrated extensions of the federal government itself. Chapter 8: Corporate Profits versus Public Funds. The sheer volume of taxpayer money directed to these titans raises critical questions regarding the allocation of corporate profits versus the enhancement of public utility. A close examination reveals a glaring disconnect between the wealth generated for corporate executives and the actual performance or delivery of the products funded by the public. In recent years, Department of Defense studies found that leading defense contractors actually spent more money paying out dividends to shareholders and buying back their own stock than they spent on research, development, and capital investments like building new factories. A stock buyback is when a company uses its cash to buy its own shares on the open market. This reduces the number of shares available, which automatically raises the price of the remaining shares. This financial engineering directly enriches corporate executives whose compensation packages are heavily tied to stock options. It prioritizes short-term financial gains over the long-term strategic needs of the military. Executive compensation within these firms has reached astronomical levels. Let us look at the leaders of the defense titans. Kathy Warden, the CEO of Northrop Grumman, received total compensation packages exceeding $24.7 million in 2023 and $24.3 million in 2024. Christopher Callio, the leader of RTX, saw his compensation jump to nearly $24.8 million for 2025. Perhaps the most striking example of corporate enrichment defying public utility is Boeing. In 2024, Boeing endured a truly disastrous year. The company suffered severe production failures, a 2-month-long machinist strike, and burned through over $14 billion in cash, reporting a massive net loss of nearly $12 billion. Yet, despite these failures, executive payouts remained staggering. Former Boeing CEO Dave Calhoun was awarded approximately $33 million in 2023. When he stepped down amid the mounting crises in 2024, he still walked away with total compensation of $15 million, including retirement gifts and vested stock. The incoming CEO, Kelly Ortberg, was brought in to turn the ailing planemaker around and received a compensation package of $18.4 million, including stock awards and a relocation allowance of over $300,000. To put this in perspective, Ortberg's annualized pay is 183 times higher than the median salary of a Boeing employee. This blatant profiteering recently prompted political backlash, with presidential executive orders threatening to restrict underperforming contractors from paying dividends or buying back stock until they can produce superior products on time and on budget. Yet the system remains firmly entrenched, ensuring that regardless of whether a weapon system performs flawlessly or fails miserably, the wealth continues to concentrate at the very top. Chapter 9. Money in Politics. The primary mechanism that allows these corporate titans to maintain such extraordinary profit margins and evade stringent accountability is their deep financial integration with the political system. The defense industry utilizes an incredibly well-funded lobbying apparatus to ensure the continuous flow of public funds. The numbers are staggering. In 2024 alone, the arms industry employed 950 registered lobbyists. When you consider that there are only 535 members of the United States Congress, that means there are nearly 2 defense lobbyists assigned for every single elected representative. Their political spending is both vast and ruthlessly pragmatic. Following the events of January 6, 2021, many of the largest defense companies publicly paused their political spending, condemning the violence and affirming a commitment to democratic principles. However, this pause was incredibly short-lived. Shortly thereafter, the defense sector resumed operations, collectively donating over $6 million to the lawmakers who voted against certifying the election results. In doing so, defense contractors became the largest corporate supporters of these specific politicians, vastly outspending the oil, gas, and financial sectors. Beyond direct campaign contributions, the industry exercises immense control through the revolving door, the seamless movement of personnel between government service and private sector employment. When government officials leave public service to cash in as lobbyists, advisors, or board members for the very companies they used to regulate, it fundamentally corrupts government decision-making. A detailed 2023 report titled Pentagon Alchemy, prepared by Senator Elizabeth Warren, highlighted the severity of this issue. The report identified nearly 700 cases in a single year where top defense contractors hired former government officials, military officers, or senior legislative staff. Remarkably, over 90% of these individuals became registered lobbyists for the defense firms. They leveraged their intimate knowledge of the Pentagon and their personal connections to their former colleagues to secure massive contracts. We see high-ranking officials moving directly to defense boards, former secretaries of defense and Homeland Security sitting on the boards of General Dynamics and Lockheed Martin. Furthermore, the emerging military technology sector has opened a new version of the revolving door. Dozens of former Pentagon officials are now moving to military-related venture capital and private equity firms in Silicon Valley, using their Washington connections to cash in on a new generation of weapons. This legalized alchemy turns military brass directly into corporate gold, ensuring the defense industry remains entirely insulated from meaningful reform. Chapter 10. The price of utility. When trillions of dollars are filtered through a system defined by political lobbying and corporate profit maximization, the ultimate utility of the military hardware produced is frequently compromised. Taxpayers are routinely asked to foot the bill for extreme cost overruns, only to receive platforms with questionable combat effectiveness. Two of the most expensive acquisition programs in human history, the Gerald R. Ford-class supercarriers and the F-35 Lightning II aircraft, perfectly encapsulate this problem. The USS Gerald R. Ford was designed to be the Navy's most advanced and ambitious aircraft carrier. intended to usher in a new generation of power projection. It promised improved sortie generation, allowing aircraft to launch and recover much faster than previous ships. To achieve this, it boasted new technologies like electromagnetic catapults and advanced weapons elevators. However, the acquisition strategy was fundamentally flawed. The Navy chose to build the ship while 23 of its critical technologies were still completely immature. This decision led to massive reliability failures. The electromagnetic aircraft launch system, the advanced arresting gear, and the weapons elevators all suffered prolonged operational issues, forcing the ship to undergo years of expensive debugging long after it was commissioned in 2017. The cost of the lead ship ballooned to nearly $13 billion, representing a 23% increase over initial estimates. While the carrier eventually completed its first global deployment in 2023, it continues to suffer from plumbing issues and mechanical strain. Furthermore, critics question the strategic utility of spending $120 billion on a fleet of massive, hard-to-maintain carriers in an era dominated by advanced, cheap anti-ship missiles and drone warfare. Similarly, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program is the Department of Defense's largest aircraft acquisition program. The Congressional Budget Office recently adjusted the estimated sustainment costs for the F-35 program to an astonishing $1.58 trillion over its life cycle. Despite this astronomical price tag, the program routinely overpromises and underdelivers. Recent government audits reveal that Lockheed Martin delivered the aircraft late 91% of the time, while the engine manufacturer, Pratt & Whitney, delivered engines late 100% of the time. Furthermore, the mission-capable rates for these tactical aircraft are severely falling short of established goals. To mask these reliability issues and prevent maintenance costs from spiraling even further, the military has reportedly resorted to micromanaging flight hours, flying the jets 21% less frequently. This lack of robustness shortchanges pilot skill development and conceals the aircraft's inability to conduct high-tempo operations over sustained periods. Taxpayers are effectively paying a massive premium for a highly sophisticated system whose actual combat availability remains alarmingly fragile. Chapter 11: Historical Precedents and Lessons Learned. The systemic failures, astronomical costs, and deeply entrenched corruption of the modern military-industrial complex are not modern anomalies, they are historical constants. To understand how to navigate the current state of matters, we must look to the historical precedents where similar architectures of war profiteering were identified, investigated, and briefly challenged. In 1935, retired Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler published a short treatise bluntly titled "War is a Racket." Drawing from his experiences in the First World War, Butler defined the racket perfectly. He observed that war is the only international enterprise in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses are reckoned in human lives. He noted that the mass human suffering of soldiers consistently filled the coffers of industrialists, with the public absorbing the financial risk while private companies reaped the rewards. Butler's warnings echoed the findings of the Nye Committee. In 1934, Senator Gerald P. Nye led a special Senate investigation into the Merchants of Death, the armament manufacturers who had reaped enormous profits during World War I. Operating out of a crowded caucus room, the committee held 93 hearings and questioned over 200 witnesses, including powerful financiers like J.P. Morgan, Jr. They scoured corporate records and uncovered rampant conflicts of interest, bribery of foreign officials, and questionable practices that steered national policy purely for corporate gain. A few years later, as the United States entered the Second World War, another crucial precedent was set. In 1941, Senator Harry S. Truman established the Truman Committee to investigate waste, inefficiency, and war profiteering in the National Defense Program. Operating initially with a tiny budget of just $15,000, the bipartisan committee held hundreds of public hearings. They exposed monumental corporate malfeasance, ultimately saving the government an estimated $10 to $15 billion and preserving thousands of soldiers' lives by ensuring they received functional, safe equipment. The lessons drawn from these historical events are profound and directly applicable to our current situation. When Eisenhower gave his final warning about the disastrous rise of misplaced power, he understood history. He knew that without relentless, aggressive, and independent auditing, akin to the Truman Committee, the profit motive would inevitably subsume the national interest. Today's trillion-dollar accounting black holes, the pervasive revolving door, and the prioritization of stock buybacks over functional fighter jets are the exact manifestations of the power Eisenhower predicted. The historical record demonstrates clearly that the military-industrial complex will never reform itself voluntarily. It only responds to intense public scrutiny and unwavering legislative courage. Without cooling-off periods for defense lobbyists, without strict enforcement of anti-corruption laws, and without independent financial audits, the system will continually default to its basest nature. If we fail to heed these historical lessons, the racket continues, and we are left with the reality Julian Assange identified, an architecture designed not for successful defense, but for endless war, washing taxpayer wealth away into the shadows. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics, the history, and the future of the military-industrial complex. Understanding how the world works means looking past the daily headlines and taking the time to understand the invisible financial plumbing, the legal frameworks, and the historical precedents that truly dictate global power. Until next time, keep questioning the narratives and keep exploring how our world is built.